Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the FT's political journalist Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and the Telegraph's assistant comment editor Olivia Utley, with us from now until just before midnight. And welcome to both of you on what is once again another very busy day. So to the front pages then, the Telegraph says Boris Johnson is under pressure to release the full version of Sue Gray's report into parties at Downing Street during lockdown. The Metro reacts to the announcement of a police investigation into those gatherings, declaring, "You've had your parties, now here is the bill." Here's the Eyes, big splash, PM in peril as police called in. The Guardian also says Mr Johnson's position is perilous, while the Financial Times describes the Prime Minister as gearing up for a fight for survival. The Times writes Johnson could face a police interview over the party's allegations. The Sun making a joke of it, picturing a police officer marching into number 10. And the Star reports that investigators have been sent pictures of the PM at number 10 with wine bottles close by. Its headline, Plonker. Well, the Daily Express remarks the public want a line drawn under Partygate too. Well, just a quick reminder, by scanning the QR code that you will see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's bring in our guests this evening. We're joined tonight by Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and Olivia Utley. I'm clearly at Downing Street for a very important reason. Jasmine, what an extraordinary day once again for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's been a very, very intense day. And I think there is a sense that definitely heading into tomorrow and the rest of the week, things aren't actually going to calm down. This morning, we heard from the Met that they were launching an investigation into some of the allegations of rule breaking in Downing Street and across Whitehall. And the PM said that he welcomed the report and he wanted to draw a line under it. And in some ways, it is in the government's advantage to essentially get this over and done with. This has been hanging over the government for weeks now, and we've seen a drip, drip, drip of new allegations and new stories coming in. But it's not a great look for the PM to have the police investigating his officials and investigating his conduct throughout the pandemic. I think this is a story that really resonates with the public because the pandemic was something that forced the government to make policies that impacted everyone. Everyone had a birthday over the pandemic, everyone had a story, everyone made sacrifices. And this lingering idea that those making the rules weren't actually following them, and now the police have to get involved, it's really not looking great for the PM.
Yes, and if we look at your paper, Olivia, it's not every day you see Dame Cressida Dick on the front page there while talking about a possible police interview with the Prime Minister. But your headline is the pressure on Johnson to release the full Gray report. What is the distinction there? What might be published instead of the full report?
Well, this morning, the Telegraph front page really gives quite a good indication of how the events of the day have played out, and it has been a very dramatic day. This morning we heard that there was going to be this police investigation, and for a while it looked as though that police investigation might delay the publication of the Gray report, which sort of paradoxically might actually be quite good for the Prime Minister, because the Gray report is what he's sort of dreading, and the longer that's held off for, the police investigation would take a while. There's always the chance that Russia invades Ukraine, the world's got their eye somewhere else, and the whole thing fizzles out. And then yesterday, that there were sort of indications that the Prime Minister might not actually publish the report in full. He might just sort of talk about the findings in the report, and it was made clear that it was at the Prime Minister's discretion how much of the report he was going to publish. But as the front page of the Telegraph makes clear, all of that sort of changed over the course of the day. Sue Gray and the police have now both made clear that there's no legal impediment or no impediment in either of their eyes to the Sue Gray report being published concurrently with the police investigation. And it now looks like that report actually might be published tomorrow. And then you've got Sue Gray quoted there in that report, in the report in the Telegraph, saying that she would like the report to be published in full. There's now just a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister to publish the whole report, no redactions, not just the findings, not just a summary, but the whole report in full, while the police investigation is happening too. So if we're talking about dramatic crunches, it's about as dramatic as you can possibly get.
Absolutely, and that reflected in the Financial Times as well, Jasmine. Johnson gears up for a fight for survival, and many of the newspapers saying that really this, critically, is the most serious 48 hours in his premiership so far.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think generally MPs on the backbenches are really sort of falling into two camps. So there are those who would argue that actually we should wait until the Gray report is published, we should wait until the Met have finished their inquiries, and then they'll make a judgment as to whether actually letters need to be submitted or whether a line can be drawn under the whole affair. And then there are those who actually argue, well, we've seen enough, we've heard enough, and actually Johnson's becoming a liability. Their argument is that the Johnson who was elected in 2019, who managed to win over those red wall voters and red wall seats, who managed to win that huge majority, they're arguing actually that's not the Johnson we're seeing now. And I think especially some MPs in seats where there are small majorities and where they believe that Labour voters effectively lent their vote to the Conservative MPs, there's a real questioning of Johnson's leadership. And so I think we're really seeing this sort of concern on the backbenches as to whether Johnson is the right person to be leading them into this next stage. And I think in some ways Johnson's slightly lucky in that even though there's all this concern on the backbenches, there isn't actually a natural successor. There's talk of Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. But then the question is, does the next Conservative leader want to be sort of coming in at a point of rising tax and at a point where we've got the local elections around the corner?
Absolutely, yes. The cost of living crisis, the May elections, the list goes on for whoever is in charge. If we look at the eye as well, peril too, Olivia, is the word they use. And they say that Downing Street aides fear an avalanche of no confidence letters from backbenchers. Presumably, should Sue Gray find that the actions here in Downing Street and elsewhere across Whitehall were wanting. But of course, because it's already gone to the police, in a sense, do we already know the verdict?
I think it's sort of easy to underplay the importance of the Sue Gray report, actually, given the police investigation. But I do think it's incredibly important because the MPs who are sort of not staunch Boris allies, but haven't yet sent in their letters of no confidence, I think are probably sort of hoping for a ladder to climb down. They're hoping that there'll be something in the Gray report that they can cling on to that allows them to say, look, we can draw a line under this. It's bad, but we can move on, and we don't need a change of leader now. They're looking for something that allows them to back Boris, because as Jasmine says, there is no obvious replacement. But if the Sue Gray report is very, very damning in its language, and because the Prime Minister has built it up to such a degree, we've all been talking about this for so many days, and all of Westminster is so ready for this Sue Gray report. And if it comes out as totally damning, then those MPs have got sort of nothing left to hold on to, and their constituents are really going to be pushing them to send in those letters of no confidence. So I think, although one could say that the police investigation has sort of taken the wind out of Sue Gray's sails, I think that would be sort of slightly to misunderstand where Tory MPs are sitting this evening.
Yes, the Guardian too talks about peril, and Olivia's right, isn't she, Jasmine? The PM and many of the cabinet who've been questioned have been hiding behind Sue Gray like the shield of Captain America, or in the case of Boris Johnson, possibly St. George, if he had a shield. But what does he hide behind once this is over? I mean, how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, it's so uncertain at the moment. And there have been so many points over the past few days where we sort of thought letters were going to go in and then it sort of all died down. I think what is clear is that there is a sense of weariness, not just among the cabinet, but backbenchers as well, that this has gone on for such a long time. We heard in the Commons today that there are MPs saying there's a cost of living crisis, there's issues with Ukraine. There's a frustration that MPs are having to talk about this, and that instead of talking about policy announcements or sort of trying to work through the manifesto, actually this is sort of paralysed government. And so there is a massive frustration around that, and I think it's not clear how this will play out, but I do think people want to draw a line under this effectively.
And The Sun, a bit of fun with this, hello, quite a nice front page from them. It makes the point about the police inquiry in an accessible way. But there has been defence today, advisors and ministers, former people who've worked with people here, suggesting that actually this is a unique building. It's like a submarine, it's like a TARDIS, and for Boris Johnson, of course, it's his home and his office. All of these distinguishing features about Downing Street. Will any of those, do you think, be used in defence when we finally get Sue Gray's report?
I don't think those defences sort of play particularly well with the public. This idea that the kind of Downing Street drinking culture isn't quite the sort of defence that MPs think it is. I don't think, that well, we're all just drinking at work. That's not the way most people work. And also, if you were, a builder who'd been working very hard on a building site all day in May 2020, went to have a drink with your colleagues on a bench, then you would have been sent home by the police. So I don't really think that stands. There are some defences that aides and Boris Johnson supporters can sort of pull out the hat. I think talking about what Boris Johnson has done well in the past 6 months or so could be sort of beneficial for them. But I think that's probably a stronger defence to talk about how Britain is most antibody-rich country in the world, how we're leading the country out of the pandemic. Those are all big Boris Johnson ticks by his name. He's doing very well on Ukraine, obviously better than most of the EU. So I think those are the sort of defences that Boris Johnson and allies should be going with, rather than this thing that the rules didn't really apply to the Prime Minister because it's Crown property, or they like drinking at their desks, and so work is kind of a party. I don't really think that sits very well with the public.
Well, and how much he can throw forward to global events as well, namely Ukraine, and that is where we turn our attention to next. How might Britain get involved in the conflict in Ukraine? That in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview live from Downing Street tonight. Big issues, obviously, on the Prime Minister's plate. We're joined once again by Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and Olivia Utley. Welcome back to both of you. And, of course, he chose today to make a statement in the House of Commons about Ukraine, which is extremely serious. Olivia, let's look at the Times front page and about the potential contribution that the UK could make to NATO's effort.
Yeah, and to start, it was a very statesmanlike speech from Boris Johnson, actually, and it was very interesting to see the way the tone in the House of Commons changed. We had all the sort of party political points going, as you'd expect, about Downing Street and cakes and everything, and then you got the sort of very kind of honest, earnest commendation for what the government's doing in Ukraine from all sides of the House. And this quite powerful speech from the Prime Minister. And what it seems like Britain is now planning to do is we're readying troops to send to Hungary to bolster defences there. And it looks like the West is considering imposing very, very harsh sanctions on Russia, which would involve cutting Russia off from the world's payment system, which would basically stop Russia having access to to Western banks overnight, and cutting Russia off completely economically. So it does seem like Western leaders are kind of pulling together now, and it does seem like Britain is actually leading the charge here.
And the big issue, of course, is gas for Europe. Germany, obviously, is set great stall by Nord Stream 2, this gas pipeline, which is at abeyance at the moment, has not been fully sanctioned. And The Guardian suggesting that actually there might be other means of circumventing the import of Russian gas as a means of protecting Europe.
Yeah, so there's been concern over what's happening in Ukraine for several weeks now. And I think the big question was, how far are Western allies and NATO prepared to go to effectively prevent Russia from expanding? And I think there is a lot of fear at what this means for sort of oil and gas supplies. We know that Russia is sort of a big player in that field. And so the US is naturally trying to reassure its European allies that actually, regardless of what happens, there are alternatives, and there is support available. And I think, just touching on Olivia's point, I think we saw a very sort of confident Johnson in the House of Commons talking about Ukraine. There is a sense that actually the UK is trying to lead the charge on this, and I think on one hand that's quite helpful politically for Johnson, because he can point to Ukraine and say, look, we've got bigger issues at hand here. We shouldn't be talking about birthday cakes and parties. Look at what's happening around the corner. Actually, we've got potentially a big crisis on our hands. And I think for those Johnson allies in the House of Commons, they can also point to what's happening and say, well, is now the time for a change of leader or a leadership contest, when actually we should stick with Johnson and hope that actually he's the best person to lead us through not just domestic, but potentially international crisis.
Yes, and indeed on social media, some suggesting what the PM needs is a Falklands moment, which is a very extreme bit of red meat to throw, is it not? For the moment, both of you, thank you both very much indeed. Live from Downing Street as we still await that report from Sue Gray. So Olivia and Jasmine, thank you both very much indeed.